Welcome to Logic Over Faith. There is something fascinating about stories. Human beings have always told stories to make sense of the world, to pass on values, and to explain the mysteries of life. Some stories inspire us, others make us laugh, and some are so strange that they leave us shaking our heads. When it comes to religion, we often find stories that are not just strange but outright foolish when looked at with reason and logic. People accept these tales as sacred truth. But when you step back and think about them, they sound more like fairy tales than reality. Let's take a deep dive into some of the most foolish religious stories ever told, the ones that reveal more about human imagination than about the universe. One of the most famous stories is the tale of Noah's Ark. The story goes that God, angry with humanity for being sinful, decided to flood the entire world and wipe out all living things, except for one family and a collection of animals. Noah was commanded to build a massive wooden ark to house his family and pairs of every animal species. At first glance, it might seem like a dramatic story of survival. But think about it practically. The Earth has millions of species, from insects to mammals to marine life. How could Noah possibly collect 2 of each species, care for them, feed them, and keep them alive in a wooden boat? Even today with our technology, transporting that many animals would be impossible. Diseases would spread, predators would attack prey, food would run out. The logistics make no sense. Not to mention, the flood supposedly covered the entire planet, which means water would have covered Mount Everest as well. Where would all that water have come from? And where did it go afterwards? This story might have been an ancient attempt to explain local floods, but taken literally, it becomes one of the most foolish stories ever imagined. If we tried to repeat Noah's feat today with all our modern tools, it would still fail. Another strange story is the tale of Jonah and the whale. According to the Bible, Jonah refused to follow God's command, and as punishment he was swallowed by a huge fish or whale. He stayed inside its belly for 3 days and 3 nights before being spit out alive. On the surface, this sounds like a powerful message about repentance and second chances. But biologically and logically it makes no sense. Whales do not have the anatomy to house a human being alive. Their stomachs are filled with digestive acids that would kill a person in minutes. Even if you survived the swallowing, you would suffocate without air. And 3 days inside would mean death from lack of oxygen, dehydration, and digestion. The idea that Jonah walked out alive is as believable as someone living inside an oven for 3 days without being burned. Yet, this story is told to children as if it really happened, when it is clear that it belongs in the realm of fables, not facts. Perhaps one of the most disturbing yet foolish stories is the tale of Lot and his wife. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God supposedly destroyed 2 cities because the people were wicked. Lot and his family were told to escape, but warned not to look back. As they fled, Lot's wife glanced back at the city, and instantly she was turned into a pillar of salt. Think about that for a moment. A human being looking over her shoulder and being magically transformed into a block of salt. Does this sound like divine justice or more like a mythical curse from an ancient storyteller trying to scare people into obedience? Salt pillars form naturally in desert areas, and this story might have been created to explain their existence. Instead of saying they were geological formations, storytellers invented a supernatural tale. And yet, many believers still think it literally happened. What kind of lesson is this supposed to teach? That curiosity deserves a death sentence? It is another example of how ancient people mistook superstition for truth. Then there is the Tower of Babel story, one of the most unintentionally funny tales in religious texts. Humanity, united in language, decided to build a massive tower that reached the heavens. God, feeling threatened, decided to confuse their speech so they could no longer understand one another, and the tower project collapsed. From this, believers claim we got the diversity of languages in the world. But the idea is absurd. Imagine the creator of the universe feeling threatened by a pile of bricks. The thought that humans could build a tower tall enough to reach heaven makes no sense in light of modern science. We know space extends infinitely, and the Earth itself is tiny in the universe. Even the tallest skyscrapers today only scratch the atmosphere, not the stars. Language diversity comes from cultural and social evolution, not from a divine act of sabotage. The Tower of Babel story reveals more about the insecurity of ancient gods than about reality. Another foolish tale is the story of Balaam's talking donkey. In this story, a man named Balaam was on his way somewhere when his donkey suddenly stopped, refusing to move. Frustrated, Balaam began to beat the animal. But then something incredible happened. The donkey began to speak in human language, rebuking Balaam for his behavior. On one level, this is meant to show that God can use anything, even an animal, to send a message. But let's be honest, the idea of a donkey speaking fluent human language is pure fantasy. Donkeys do not have vocal cords or the brain structures to form words, let alone sentences. If this story were told outside of religion, people would laugh at it the same way they laugh at fairy tales about talking animals. Yet, because it is written in a religious text, people treat it as sacred. The moment you apply the same logic you would use with any other story, you see how ridiculous it really is. Then there is the bizarre story of Samson and his magical hair. Samson was a man supposedly blessed with incredible strength as long as he never cut his hair. He fought lions with his bare hands and defeated armies, but when his hair was cut, he lost his strength. Eventually, his hair grew back, and with one last act of strength, he pulled down a building, killing himself and his enemies. The moral is supposed to be about faith and obedience, but the logic falls apart. Hair is just dead protein fibers. Cutting it does not weaken your muscles. Imagine if strength could be transferred through hair length. Barbershops would be the most dangerous places in the world. Clearly, the story is symbolic, but taken literally, it is foolish. Strength comes from muscle, nutrition, and training, not from hair length. It is another example of how myths were mistaken for fact. Equally strange is the story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho. According to the book of Joshua, the Israelites marched around the city of Jericho for 7 days, blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, the walls of the city collapsed miraculously, allowing them to conquer it. The idea that sound waves from trumpets could bring down stone fortifications is beyond foolish. If sound had that kind of destructive power, every marching band would be a weapon. Archaeological evidence also shows that Jericho's walls did not fall in the way the story describes. But for believers, the story remains a miracle of divine intervention. In reality, it is simply another attempt to glorify conquest through supernatural storytelling. One of the darkest yet most nonsensical stories is Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son. In the Bible, God tests Abraham's faith by ordering him to kill his child. Just as Abraham is about to do it, God stops him and provides a ram instead. Believers interpret this as a story of faith and obedience, but step back and think about it. What kind of moral lesson comes from a father being willing to kill his own son just to prove loyalty? If any parent today claimed they were about to sacrifice their child because God told them to, society would see them as delusional or dangerous. The story glorifies blind obedience over compassion and rational thought. It is presented as holy, but it is really a disturbing example of how religion can twist morality into something grotesque. Another foolish story is the idea of a global resurrection where billions of bodies will rise from their graves at the end of time. Religious texts describe graves opening, bodies reassembling, and everyone standing before God for judgment. But think about what this means in practical terms. Many people died thousands of years ago. Their bodies decomposed into dust, scattered into the soil, or dissolved in the ocean. Some were cremated, some eaten by animals. How would these bodies be reassembled? Would people come back in the condition they died in? Would someone who lost a limb return without it? The logistics of billions of bodies physically rising defy every law of biology and physics we know. Yet, it is a central belief for many religions. Taken literally, it is one of the most foolish concepts humanity has ever accepted. These stories are just a few examples, and when you look at them with clear eyes, they reveal a pattern. Ancient people were trying to explain the world with the tools they had, relying on imagination, fear, and myth. Over time, these tales were elevated into sacred truths, and questioning them was forbidden. But today, with knowledge of science, history, and reason, we can see them for what they really are. They are not divine revelations, but human stories, filled with flaws, contradictions, and foolishness. And the fact that billions still treat them as unquestionable truth shows how powerful tradition and belief can be, even when logic says otherwise. When we step back and think about these stories, one thing becomes clear. They were not designed for people with modern knowledge. They were created thousands of years ago, at a time when people did not understand natural disasters, biology, or the vastness of the universe. Floods, earthquakes, diseases, and language differences needed explanations. Instead of science, people turned to myth. These myths were then handed down, written into holy books, and treated as unquestionable truth. But when we look at them now, they read less like truth and more like fairy tales. Let us go deeper into the logic, or rather the lack of it, behind these tales. Take the story of Jonah again. Imagine trying to teach biology in a classroom and saying, yes, humans can live inside a whale's stomach for 3 days without oxygen, food, or water. Students would laugh. If you tried to prove it, no scientist could replicate it. Yet in religious settings, people are told to accept it without question. If we accept Jonah's story as possible, then by the same logic, we would have to accept that people can live inside volcanoes, or inside the sun, simply because a story says so. What makes it even more foolish is that believers often laugh at myths from other religions. A Christian might laugh at Hindu tales of gods with elephant heads or multiple arms, while at the same time accepting Jonah's story as fact. This double standard reveals how people suspend critical thinking when it comes to their own faith. The same applies to Noah's Ark. If we treated it as literal history, we would expect to see evidence of a global flood. Yet geology, archaeology, and history all prove otherwise. Civilizations in Egypt and China continued uninterrupted during the supposed flood period. Trees have growth rings older than the date religious texts claim the flood happened. Animal species are distributed across continents in ways that make no sense if they all started from one boat landing in the Middle East. For example, how did kangaroos hop all the way to Australia without leaving bones behind across Asia? How did penguins march from Antarctica to the Middle East? How did freshwater fish survive when the entire world was covered in salt water? Believers often say it was a miracle, but using miracles to explain everything just avoids the obvious conclusion. The story is not real. It is a myth based on local floods, stretched into a global legend. The story of Lot's wife is also an example of fear-based storytelling. Turning into a pillar of salt for looking back teaches people not to question, not to hesitate, and not to be curious. The moral is obedience, not wisdom. If we applied this lesson today, it would be dangerous. Imagine telling children, never look back or ask questions or you will be destroyed. That is not morality, it is control. And notice how the punishment does not fit the crime. Looking back is a natural human reaction. If a city behind you was being destroyed, anyone would want to glance at it. The fact that the story punishes normal human behavior shows that it was designed to scare people into blind obedience, not to guide them with reason. The Tower of Babel is another case where fear and control are hidden beneath the surface. If the story were true, then God divided humanity simply to stop cooperation. Think about what that implies. Instead of celebrating human progress, creativity, and teamwork, the story teaches that progress angers God. Even more ironic is that today we actually do build towers that scrape the sky, and nothing supernatural happens. Airplanes fly higher than any tower, satellites orbit the planet, and spacecraft travel beyond the atmosphere. None of these achievements were stopped by divine intervention. The diversity of languages has been studied by linguists, and we know it developed naturally over thousands of years. The Tower of Babel story is not just foolish, it also discourages human ambition and cooperation by turning them into sins. Balaam's talking donkey may be one of the most laughable stories, but it also reveals something about human psychology. Ancient storytellers often gave animals human traits to make stories more engaging. We see the same thing in fables like Aesop's tales or modern cartoons. But when religion does it, the story is elevated to sacred status. If we read about a talking donkey in a children's book, we would enjoy it as fantasy. When it is in the Bible, people are expected to treat it as literal truth. This shows how much authority religion has over human thinking. People suspend their common sense simply because the story is packaged as divine. The story of Samson is another tale that, when taken literally, creates absurd ideas about strength and power. If hair truly gave strength, then then bald people would be weak and powerless. But history shows us that strength comes from training and environment, not hair. Ancient people probably used this story to symbolize dedication and purity, but later generations took it literally. Today it is still told as a true account. If a modern movie showed a superhero who loses strength when his hair is cut, audiences would recognize it as fantasy. But when the same story is in a religious book, it becomes unquestioned truth. This shows how belief can distort logic. The fall of Jericho's walls after trumpet blasts is another example. Sound can be powerful, but it cannot topple stone walls. Engineers know this, archaeologists know this, and yet the story persists as a miracle. What is more likely, that stone walls collapsed because of divine sound waves, or that this is just a myth to glorify a conquest? History is full of conquerors exaggerating their victories. Victors often claim that gods were on their side, making their success inevitable. The Jericho story is no different. It was a way of saying, our God is stronger than your walls. But when stripped of its religious coating, it becomes obvious that it is a tale of propaganda, not reality. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son is perhaps the most disturbing of them all. The story normalizes blind obedience to authority, even at the cost of morality. In today's world, we call it child abuse. If anyone tried this today, they would be arrested. Yet the story is praised as an example of faith. This shows how dangerous it is to base morality on obedience rather than compassion. Many atrocities in history have been committed by people who claimed they were simply obeying God or authority. Wars, persecutions, and even genocides have roots in this kind of thinking. The Abraham story is foolish not just because it is unrealistic, but because it teaches the wrong lesson about morality. Finally, the idea of a global resurrection at the end of time highlights the gap between ancient imagination and modern science. The image of billions of bodies rising from graves might have seemed powerful to ancient listeners, but today we know it is impossible. The materials that make up our bodies recycle into the earth, into plants, into animals, into the air itself. There is no central storage of intact bodies waiting to rise. Even if you believed a god could magically reassemble them, the bigger question remains. Why would that be necessary? If a god has the power to judge souls, why wait for decayed bodies to reform? The story reveals how much ancient religion was tied to physical imagery because people could not imagine concepts beyond the body. But in the end, it becomes another foolish tale, disconnected from reality. When you look at these stories together, a pattern emerges. They are not the result of divine wisdom, but of human imagination trying to explain a confusing world. Floods became global judgments. Talking animals became divine messengers, and towers became threats to gods. They are myths, not facts. The foolishness lies not just in the stories themselves, but in the way people still cling to them as literal truth. We live in a world where we can map the human genome, land rovers on Mars, and explore the depths of the ocean, yet billions still believe a man once lived inside a fish, or that a woman turned into salt for looking back. This gap between knowledge and belief shows the power of tradition, but it also shows the need for critical thinking. It is important to remember that questioning these stories is not about mocking people, but about highlighting how human imagination can be mistaken for truth. The same way we outgrew beliefs in Zeus throwing lightning bolts or Thor swinging his hammer, we can also outgrow these ancient tales. Stories can still hold symbolic meaning, but they should not be treated as literal history or unquestionable truth. When we free ourselves from treating foolish stories as facts, we open the door to a better understanding of reality, one based on evidence, compassion, and reason. So the next time you hear these religious tales, remember to ask yourself, does this story make sense in the real world? Does it stand up to evidence and reason? Or is it simply another human attempt to explain the unknown? The answer is usually obvious. These stories may have entertained or controlled people in the past, but today they stand as reminders of how far we have come, and how far we still need to go in separating myth from reality.